Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode in talking about the Shivat Zion, return to Zion, and the different approaches to the Geula, to the redemption. What does it mean that people were going through in this period that we see from the different biblical texts that we're looking at? Okay. So we are going to be looking, as I mentioned last class, we're going to be including in that the second half of Yeshayahu, of Isaiah, what we call second Isaiah. I don't split it into second and third Isaiah. There isn't that much as much of a reason to do that. And again, it mentions Cyrus by name. It's talking in a different historical context than the first part of the book, which is firmly in during the rise of the Assyrian Empire, during the height of the Assyrian Empire. In fact, I'm going to be starting with a couple verses from Yeshayahu that talks about the issue that we're discussing this week, which is a king, or you could even say a Messiah, Mashiach. How important is that for this redemption? Right now, these days, we take it for granted that the Messianic age includes a Messiah. Now, that's true in general. I don't know of any modern Jewish religious approach that doesn't have a Messiah, right? However, this was not always the case. You didn't have to have a central human person to talk about redemption. All you needed was for God to redeem us, as it were. Okay. And we're going to see that very much in Yeshayahu. Now, again, the first half of Yeshayahu talks about specific kings in the Assyrian period, but not this part of Yeshayahu, which is firmly based in Shivat Zion and the return to Zion. We're going to be looking at a passage that doesn't talk about David. It's kind of an exception to the rule, but is making actually a very specific point. So let's dive in and see how Yeshayahu talks about second Isaiah talks about this issue. Are there any questions before I begin? Okay. All right, let's dive in. Okay, we're starting with Yeshayahu Nun Bet, Isaiah 52. And here we have kind of the declaration of the return to the land and the much awaited redemption. And this is, again, the promise that we shall return to the land, that we shall be, once again, the nation returns. Okay. But not just that, the nation will know God, right? L'chein yeda ami shemi, l'chein bayom hahu, ki ani hu hamidaber hineni. Therefore, my nation will know my name on that day because I am the one who speaks. Here I am. Right. And now we're talking about the announcer of the redemption. Ma navu al heharim ragle mevaser, mashmia shalom, mevaser tov, mashmia Yeshua, omer letzion, malach Elohayich. What is the news? The news is how lovely on the hills are the feet of the person who's coming, of the herald, who's announcing peace, well-being, who's telling us of good, who's speaking of the salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns, your God is king, right? So who is the king? God is the king, all right? And this is the important part of the redemption, that God is returning, as it were, to Zion, right? Right. Your lookouts raise their voices together, we together enjoy, because by their eyes they will see when God returns to Zion. We don't need a person who's the king, it's God. Okay. Let's take a look at something similar. Let's start actually with Yeshayahu Nun Hey, Isaiah 55. Okay. I'm going to look at 55:3. What I'm exploring here is, let's look at an attitude where there's no king at all. And you don't need a king for this. You don't need a king for the redemption. All you need is God. That's what the prophet is saying here. And it says, and this is God speaking, Hatu oznechem ulechu elai, Hatu oznechem ulechu elai, Okay, incline your ears and come to me. Shim'u u'tuchi nafshechem. Listen, and you will give life to your souls. You will live again. Okay, ve'echreta lechem brit olam, and I will make with you a covenant, an eternal covenant. Chasdei David hane'emanim. The kindnesses, the lasting kindnesses of David. This is what God has promised to David. Okay, so what did God promise to David? Let's take a look at Shmuel Bet Zion. So I'm looking at 2 Samuel, Shmuel Bet, Perek Zion, chapter 7. Okay, let's go to verse 15, Tetvav. Okay. And where God makes his promise to David, v'chasdi lo yasur mimenu, right? My kindness will never go away from David. Okay, that is that it's referring to this promise that God made that I will never remove my kindness from David. And now, what is it? Who is it being transferred to? Let's go back to our verse in Yeshayahu and Isaiah. Who is God making the covenant with? And the everlasting kindness of David. Who is getting it? The entire nation. God is addressing the whole nation. God will now make that covenant with the whole nation, not just with the house of David. And it's an everlasting covenant. Okay. And now it's going to explain a little bit what was the role of David and what is transferring to this nation Israel. Hen ed le'umim nitativ, nagid u'mitzaveh le'umim. I made him either a leader or a witness to the people. So the witness kind of God's presence to the peoples. Nagid u'mitzaveh le'umim, a leader and a commander of peoples. Hen goy lo teda tikra, v'goy lo yedu'ucha elecha yarutzu, leman Adonai Elohecha, v'likdosh Yisrael ki fe'arach. You, he's talking now to the nation. A nation that you don't know, you shall call. And a nation that doesn't know you will run to you, that didn't know you before, will run to you for the Lord, for God, and for the holiness of Israel, because that is your glory, right? So what's going on here? David had this role, right? David had, in fact, excuse me, we can see this in Shmuel Bet Chaf Bet. This is actually really drawing from verses spoken to David or by David. Shmuel Bet Chaf Bet, 2 Samuel 22 is actually a psalm that's spoken by David, right? And it's paralleled in Mizmor Yud Chet, Psalm 18. And here we have verse 44. But tifalteni merive ami, okay, God, you have rescued me from the arguments of my people. Tishmereni lirosh goyim, you've kept me in order to be the head of nations. Am lo yadati yavduni, a nation that doesn't know me will serve me. Let's go back to our verse in Yeshayahu, in Isaiah, right? A nation that doesn't know you will come running to you. In other words, I, God, am taking the promise to David and I am giving it to you as a nation. Why as a nation? Because there's no king. There's no king who's taking over for David in this framework. Who's taking over? Who's getting this blessing? The ones who are getting this blessing is the entire nation, right? So here, similarly, if we look in Yeshayahu Samech Bet, that's Isaiah 60, verse 2, it's the same sort of thing where God is talking to the people, right? I'll just actually skip to verse 3. Nations will go by your light, and kings according to your glow, your radiance. So in other words, all this is actually, it's not clear here. Is it the nation or is it Zion, right? As a place. Okay. But we see that this idea that nations will serve you, will come to you, this is kind of it's being broadened. It's not the king, it's the nation. Now, why would we want to say something like this? Because, and possibly because, let's remember the framework of the return to Zion. The return to Zion doesn't have a king. There is no king in the return to Zion. We're going to see as we look at Haggai and Zechariah, that you can kind of create a king. You can kind of turn someone into a king in your mind. But the fact is, the Persian Empire is letting the people return and rebuild their temple. And we have a governor who is of our ilk. There is a Judean governor who can even be from the Davidic line. Is he a king? Is he not a king? In the view of the prophet of Yeshayahu Bet, it doesn't matter who's the governor. It doesn't matter. God is the king. And God has taken all of the good that's been promised to the Davidic line and he's given it to the entire nation. Okay. Now what we're going to do, I'm going to take a pause for questions, but I'll tell you what we're going to do next. What we're going to do is we're going to look and see a little bit more historically, right? The attitude towards, specifically the hopes for one specific almost king, Zerubbabel, and one specific Kohen Gadol, high priest, which is Yeshua, right? Those two characters are very important in Haggai, in Zechariah, and someone in Haggai, Zerubbabel, in Zechariah, and in the beginning of Ezra. And we'll see what seems to happen with this pair and kind of the problems that happen when you have humans, right? Why would you want to say it doesn't matter who the ruler is, the king is God? First of all, because it's a nice religious statement, right? You say there's only one ruler and that is God, right? And we have this idea in the book of Samuel, in Shmuel, right? The people go to Shmuel and say, we want a king. And he gets really upset. And God says, hey, they're not rebelling against you. They're rebelling against me, right? Because really, God should be the king. So this is not a completely new idea that God is the king and whoever rules is a minor character. But we're going to see that the desire for a king is very, very strong, still, at least among certain groups in Shivat Zion and the return to Zion. I'm going to pause now for comments and questions. Let me take a look at the chat and also feel free to raise your hands. Let's see. So Susan says, no king. Is this just a concession to reality? Oh, yes, it's very possibly a concession to reality. However, it also draws from ideas that it's not the ruler is not important. Now, it could also simply draw from the idea of how disappointing previous rulers were. Because if you're coming from, especially if you're talking about, so for example, in Yirmiyahu, it says specifically that Yehoiachin, and it sounds like Yehoiachin's line will not get to rule again. And we'll see that Zerubbabel is actually the grandson of Yehoiachin, right? But as soon as you have people, there are disappointment. There have been kings who are tremendous disappointments. And this is a way of saying this is not a human thing. This is a divine role, and we serve God. So it's both, right? It's a theological statement, and also it deals with reality, right? Any questions or comments before I continue?
Miriam?
Here I am.
I'm wondering, is this possibly a bit of a conflict between the first and second Yeshayahu? Because the first Yeshayahu does talk about V'yatzachoter migeza Yishai. Talks about the second Yeshayahu maybe doesn't.
Yes, absolutely. It's absolutely a difference between first Isaiah and second Isaiah. And the thing with second Isaiah is just what we saw is that it seems quite clear that God is the king. The blessings to David are going to the entire nation, right? Now, it's not, and so that is absolutely when. Also, again, first Isaiah is very rooted in the kings that ruled Judea during the Assyrian period, right? So it's very rooted in that part of history, and this is not. This part is rooted very much in the return to Zion and of course his decree, and then the return to Zion. So that's one of the several big differences between what they call first Isaiah and what they call second Isaiah. Any other questions or comments?
What is the dating of Isaiah 2 relative to Jeremiah?
Oh, so the dating of second Isaiah, so it's after Jeremiah because it's already talking about Koresh. It's already talking about the decree, Cyrus's decree. So Jeremiah is gone. Jeremiah is the prophet of the destruction, right? We don't hear from Jeremiah much past that destruction and exile, right? Now we're hearing it's a whole different period, right? We've been through the exile at this point. This is the end of the Judean exile. And second Isaiah starts with essentially the call to be comforted and mentioning Cyrus by name as a tool of God to allow the people of Israel, what now is essentially the Jewish people, the people of Judea, right, to return to their land. Now, of course, there were people who were there. There's this what's called the myth of the empty land. There were some people clearly in the countryside who had managed to stay and eke out in existence during this exilic period. Apparently, it seems like that, or came back earlier and tried to do something because it seems like there are already families in the area of Benjamin and Yehuda, kind of in the countryside, perhaps. So. But in terms of the way a lot of these books speak, especially Ezra and Nehemiah, they speak as if the land was empty, and now everyone is finally returning. But that is, again, that's absolutely the context of second Isaiah, and so we're talking in the return to Zion. We can look at our timeline again just to remind you. So here we are. So you have again the northern kingdom of Israel falling to Assyria. That's first Isaiah. First Isaiah is when, it's the siege of Jerusalem by Sennacherib. This is when you have kind of this is like around 701. That's when you're talking about, obviously a larger time frame than that, but that's when you're talking about what you could call first Isaiah, right? Second Isaiah is we're now in 538. Okay. Remember, of course, we're talking BCE, so we're going backwards in time. All right. So now I want you to note, because this is going to be important for the future, and we're probably going to go back to this. Cyrus, we have the Edict of Cyrus in 538. Okay. The temple is finally rebuilt in the reign of Darius. And that's about 16 years later. Okay. Not that they didn't attempt to build it right when they came back, but it went on a long hiatus until the temple was rebuilt. Okay. Now let's take a look. Let's go on that note. Let's dive in and see how Haggai, Zechariah, and Ezra talk about this. So let's first go into Haggai. Haggai and Zechariah are the prophets who really urge the time once we're in the second year of Darius, they're the ones who really spearhead this thing of we must rebuild the temple. It cannot wait any longer. We're going to be talking in after we finish this kind of little survey of kingship. That's our next topic. Is we're going to be talking about attitudes towards the temple. Why wasn't the temple built? Okay, and we have a lot of topics to cover in this class, so don't worry. We're going to be getting to everything, hopefully. Okay, let's look at, so in this case, I'm skipping around a little because we're not going to be talking so much about the temple. We're really going to be concentrating more on Zerubbabel and Joshua and their role. Now, who was Zerubbabel, actually? Zerubbabel is, if we look at, I'll put this is in Divrei Hayamim Aleph in First Chronicles, chapter 3, Perek Gimel. It actually tells us that Zerubbabel is the grandson of Yehoiachin. Here it's Yechoniah, right? So has a son Pedaiah, and Pedaiah has a son Zerubbabel. So Zerubbabel is the grandson of Yehoiachin. So if you believe that in fact the king will come from Yehoiachin, right? And at the end of Second Kings, that does seem to be the expectation of Melachim Bet. There's this. And Melachim Bet, as opposed to Divrei Hayamim Chronicles, it ends with not with the return to Zion, because the whoever is editing the final version of Second Kings doesn't know about the return to Zion. What they do know is that Nebuchadnezzar starts being nicer to Yehoiachin. And he's like, oh, he's being nicer to Yehoiachin. Maybe he'll let him go and he can come back and rule, right? And that's how Second Kings ends. Kind of sad, but that's the hope that you end with in Second Kings. And so that's clearly laying out the thing that the hope is going to come from Jehoiachin and not, for example, Tzidkiyahu. Okay, so
Miriam.
Zerubbabel is the grandson of Jehoiachin. Yes.
And maybe I'm wrong, but I think it turns out here that Zerubbabel is the great grandson of Jeconiah.
Well, let's take a look at the way he's described in Ezra. The big question seems to be, whose son is he, right? So Jehoiachin has a son Shaltiel, and he has a son Pedaiah, right? And here Zerubbabel is the son of Pedaiah, and in Ezra Nehemiah he's the son of Shaltiel. But either way, he's a grandson of Jehoiachin.
Where is Zerubbabel born? Is he born in Israel? He's born in Babel.
One assumes in Babylon. One assumes if he's the
Babylon.
grandson of Jeconiah.
In a sense, Zerubbabel has the same experience as everyone else in Shivat Zion. They're dreaming of Zion, but they didn't start. They're not born there. They're born in exile.
Oh, certainly, yeah. But it hasn't been that long, and he is from the Davidic line. So one assumes that there were quite a few expectations of him. We'll see those right now. So let's dive in and see some of those expectations because they're important. Okay, so let's start with Haggai. So what does Haggai say? He's God speaking to Haggai on the 24th of Kislev in the second year of Darius. Okay. He says, and more, because this is it's prophecies coming like one after the other. So that's, if we went back, you could see what year it was. Here we go. Speak to Zerubbabel, the governor, the Pecha of Yehuda, saying, I am going to shake the heaven and the earth. והפכתי כיסא ממלכות והשמדתי חוזק ממלכות הגויים והפכתי מרכבה ורוכביה וירדו סוסים ורוכביהם איש בחר ואחיק. I am going to flip the world over, right? Thrones are going to be flipped over. In other words, kingdoms are going to be switched around. Kings are going to fall. There's going to be war, right? I'm going to flip over chariots and riders and horses and their riders, and people are going to be killing each other. Bayom hahu, Ne'um Adonai tzvaot ekachacha Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel abdi Ne'um Adonai v'samticha kachotam kivacha v'charti Ne'um Adonai tzvaot. On that day, says God, the Lord of hosts, I'm going to take you, Zerubbabel, the son of Shaltiel, my servant, and I'm going to place you as a seal because I have chosen you, says God. This is almost certainly a switch on the verse in Yirmiyahu where, I'll show it, let's just do this really briefly, where it says, where God says to Yechoniah, Konyahu, he's called here, Konyahu ben Yoyakim melch Yehuda, chotam, ki im yeh Konyahu ben Yoyakim melch Yehuda, chotam al yad yimini, ki misham et kenka, et kenka. If you, Yechoniah, right? If you, Yechonyahu, are going to be were a signet on my right hand, I would rip you off, says God. In other words, I am ripping you off from kingship, from the royal line, says God to and so what we read here, right, in Haggai is saying, I am going to place you, Zerubbabel, as a signet. No, so that verse seems to be echoing here. The verse that Yirmiyahu said, this line is no more. And Haggai is like, no. That's you. That is you, Zerubbabel. Okay. Now remember, Zerubbabel is a Pecha. What is a Pecha? He is the appointed governor of Judea by the Persian Empire. So he has returned to Judea. He is from the Davidic line, and he has been appointed the official governor of Judea. So there's good reason for people to say, aha, we have our king. Let's take a look at Zechariah, who's the other prophet who's prophesying in this period, urging the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash, of the temple, and see what he says. I have to go back to Zechariah Gimel, to Zechariah 3. This is an angel speaking to Zechariah. Zechariah doesn't get a lot of direct prophecy. He gets things through angels. He gets things through visions. So here he has an angel speaking to him, Vayashev hamalach hadover bi, and this is one of the signs of the period where there's a distancing kind of from God, as it were. In other words, God is too holy to just speak to people. So we need angels as interlocutors. The angel who talked to me, he kind of woke me up like someone who's woken up from sleep. And he says, what do you see? I'm going to do this quickly. We all remember this. I see a menorah, right? And I see 7 lamps. It has 7 pipes. Ushnayim zeitim aleha. And it has 2 olive trees. Right, we always draw the symbol of Jerusalem is like with the olive branches, or the symbol of Israel is the olive branches. It's olive trees here. There are 2 olive trees above it. One is to the right of the bowl there's a bowl above the lamp. So there's one to the right of the bowl and one to the left of the bowl. Okay, so Zechariah doesn't understand. He says, "What do they mean?" And the angel's like, "You don't know what they mean?" He's like, "No, I don't." And so he explained, he says, Vayan vayomer elai lemor. So he answered, he said to me, saying, Zed dvar Hashem el Zerubbabel lemor, lo v'chayo v'lo b'choach ki im beruchi, amar Hashem tzvaot. He says to Zerubbabel, it's not by might and it's not by strength, right? But it is through my spirit, says God, the Lord of hosts. What does this mean? What it seems to be saying is, okay, you are essentially remember that, and I should have made a big profession when we were in Haggai. God says, I chose you. That's a big deal, right? In other words, okay, so he's the ruler. He's the ruler. He's the leader into redemption. They're finally going to build the Beit HaMikdash. I mean, they're finally going to build the Beit HaMikdash after many years where it's been stalled, right? Because that's when these prophecies are coming, at the 2nd year of Dariavesh. But this doesn't mean you're supposed to raise an army and rebel against the Persian Empire, right? That's not what this means. You're not supposed to storm the gates, right? You're going to fill your roles through the Spirit of God, okay? However, this is going to be, you are going to have so much help from God. Mi ata har hagadol lifnei Zerubbabel lemishor, v'tziat even haroshat shuot chen la. The large mountain shall become flat before Zerubbabel, right? And he's going to produce kind of it seems like he's talking really about the cornerstone of the temple, right? And it's going to be beautiful, okay? So it's still speaking in supernatural terms of what Zerubbabel is going to be able to do and how God will help Zerubbabel. But no, you're not supposed to attack. You're not supposed to rebel. You're not supposed to raise an army. This is going to happen through the Spirit of God. And he goes on. Word of God came to me. Yidei Zerubbabel yisdu abayit hazeh v'yadav tivatzana. The hands of Zerubbabel founded this Beit HaMikdash, this temple, and his hands are the ones that will do it, that will complete it. V'yadata ki Hashem tzvaot shalchani alechem. And you will know that, the prophet says, right? Zechariah says, you will know that God sent me. When this happens, you'll know that God sent me. You are not only starting it, you're going to finish it, Zerubbabel. Okay. And when it says, they said, Evan habdil biyad Zerubbabel shiv'a kimi vaz liyom ktanot v'samchu v'ra'uat Evan habdil biyad Zerubbabel. Okay, I'm going to stop here because the 7 is another explanation of a different symbolic vision, right? It says, so who is scornful of this small day? In other words, what is that possibly referring to? The book of Ezra describes it. Very soon after they return, they start the temple. And what they do first is they build the altar. And they say, hey, look, now we're starting building the temple, and here's the altar. And people who remembered the first temple start crying because this is nothing compared to the first temple. Fact is, the temple's not built. You've just got an altar. That's essentially what you have, and you're starting it. So this seems to be a reference to that or something similar. Whoever scorned that, once you see the stone in the hand of Zerubbabel, in other words, once you actually see it completed, you are going to rejoice. You are going to be happy. And then Zechariah asks, what are these 2 olive trees, right, that are to the right and left of this menorah, right? And the answer is, these are the 2 sons of the olive harvest, right? Would tend the master of the earth. What does that mean? The two anointed people. Who are anointed? Who are the anointed leaders? Who gets anointed in biblical Israel?
The king and the high priest.
That's right, the king and the high priest. So who are these two people? We have Zerubbabel and Yehoshua. Now let's go back. Let's go back and read something about Yehoshua, because Yehoshua is problematic. And now we start to see why Yeshayahu, the book of Yeshayahu, would not necessarily want to talk about personal leaders. Yehoshua is a problem, and we'll see. We don't know why, okay, but yet he has a very important role. Okay, so in the vision. So what does Zechariah see? Vayar'eni et Yoshua hakohen hagadol omed lifnei malach Adonai v'Satan omed al yemino lisitno. We're reading from Zechariah Zechariah 3, first verse. Okay, Pasuk Aleph. So he showed me Yoshua, the Kohen Gadol. He's already the high priest. They know they know who it is. Like, it's not like there's an argument about who's going to be the high priest, right? And the Satan, right, the accuser, is standing on his right to accuse him. Okay. Now, this again still seems to be talking about the Satan. The way we generally have it biblically is that the Satan is a member of the heavenly court. His job is to accuse sinners, right? And to trip us up, like you have in Eov and Job. But the idea is that the Satan is not like in later Christian literature where he's kind of opposing God. The Satan has a role within the divine sphere. However, it's not uncommon to find in texts that we unearth kind of we'll see, let's say amulets, etc., against this sort of presence. And here we have God himself using the language that one would use to shun a demon, as it were. Vayomer Adonai el Satan, Yig'ar Adonai b'cha Satan, v'yig'ar Adonai b'cha, habocher b'Yerushalayim halo ze'ud mutzal me'esh. God says to the Satan, he says, God rebukes you, Satan. And God rebukes you. God who has chosen Jerusalem, because this is a brand saved from fire. What is going on here? God is using the language Yig'ar b'cha, right? Which is a rebuking of a demonic character, right? God is using his own name, right? He uses the tetragrammaton name. God is using his own name the same way as a person would use God's name to try and cast out a demonic figure. God is using his own name to cast out the Satan, right? And he's saying he's casting him out. Why? Because as a remnant, as someone who has survived through the exile, Yoshua has to be saved, right? It almost sounds like we can't pick and choose. He's got to be cleansed of what he did. We don't know what he did. All right. And how do we know that he really did something? Because Yoshua was dressed in garments filled with excrement, right? Filthy garments. No, I think it actually means garments that have excrement on them. In other words, it's that filthy. And he's standing before the angel. Vayan vayomer el hamdim lefanav lemor hasiru habgadim hatzoim me'alav vayomer elav re'eh havarti me'alecha avonecha va'albesh otcha machalatzot. Right, and the angel says to the other angels who are standing with him, say, take these filthy clothes, these clothes filled with excrement, off him. And he says to Yoshua, look, I've taken your sin away, and now dress him in the robes of the priesthood. So in other words, and they Omar Yasimu Tzanif Tahora Rosho, they Yasimu Hatzanif Hatahora Rosho, V'Albishub Gadim Umalach Hashem Omein. And they, before the angel of God, they all dress him in a pure. They gave him a pure scarf for his head, a pure head covering, and clothing that now he can be accepted for the priesthood because his sin has been removed. So we already see that there's an inkling of there's a problem here. There's a problem here. And it's a problem that you have when you have a human leader who is supposed to be divinely chosen. However, this is how we can get around it. It's important. He has survived the exile. He comes back from the priestly line. He is clearly supposed to be the high priest. We will cleanse him of his sin. Okay. And then God says, now walk in my way. As long as you walk in my way, you can still keep your post as Kohen Gadol. And this is the sign. It's also, and then also, as we see later on, I'm looking at Pasuk Tet now, verse 9, the end of it, God says God is going to remove the sin of the land on one day. And we've already had this parallel by removing the sin of Yehoshua. So God can remove sin because this is simply the way it has to be.
Miriam?
Okay? Now we actually see how important he is later, and this is puzzling. Okay, we're going to come to something puzzling. Remember that the words to Zerubbabel are clear. You are going to start the building of the Beit HaMikdash. You will finish it. Haggai says, Zerubbabel, God chose you. Haggai isn't talking about Yoshua so much. Haggai's talking about Zerubbabel. God chose you, Zerubbabel. Okay, and here we have in Zechariah, so Yoshua has to be cleansed, but Zerubbabel is going to finish the Beit HaMikdash. Their prophecy, and then you will know that the prophecy is true. And Zerubbabel, just know that you're going to win through the Spirit and not through armies. Okay. However, if we skip ahead to chapter 6, to Perek Vav, okay, I am in Perek Vav, Pasuk Tet, that's chapter 6, 9, verse 9. I'm going to skip a little bit ahead. He's accepting gifts from people who have come out of Babylon. And what should you do with them? You should make crowns. Make silver and gold crowns. V'samta berosh Yoshua ben Yotzadak HaKohen HaGadol. And you should put one on the head of Yehoshua, the son of Yehotzadak, the high priest. You should you say to him, this is what God says. There's a man called Branch, and beneath him it will grow, and he will build the temple. He will build the Hechal of God. He will build the Beit HaMikdash. והוא יבנה את היכל השם, והוא יסעוד, וישב ומשל על כיסאו, והיה כהן על כיסאו, בצד שלום תהיה בין שניהם. He's going to build the Beit HaMikdash, and he will bear majesty, glory, and he will sit and he will rule from his throne, and the priest will be on his throne, and you will have a good relationship. The two of you will essentially are going to rule together. This is very different from what we heard before. What has happened, right? All of a sudden, Zerubbabel is not named. We have this Tzemach. We have a bunch of crowns that were made, and one was placed on the head of Yoshua. And so this feeds into the theory that something happened to Zerubbabel. Okay, another thing feeds into theory too. We're going to look at it in Ezra in the last few minutes of our class. And what it sounds like is, Yoshua, you get crowned because we know who you are. You're going to be a ruler. And there is going to be a ruler next to you who will manage to finish the Beit HaMikdash. You will rule together with him because we made multiple crowns, right? So that's what it sounds like, that actually it's being set up and Zerubbabel is gone. Do we know what happened to Zerubbabel? No, we do not. Let's take a quick look at Ezra and what Ezra tells us about Zerubbabel and Yoshua. So it mentions them in the third chapter in Ezra Gimel. We're in the second verse, Pasuk Bet. Ve'kam Yeshua ben Yotzadak ve'chav haKohanim, Yoshua, the son of Yotzadak, and his brethren, the priests, Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel ve'chav, and Zerubbabel son of Shaltiel, and his kind of colleagues, ve'yivnu et mizbach Elokei Yisrael la'alot alav olot kakatuv b'Torat Moshe ish ha'Elokim. So he says they came and they built the altar. Okay, so they built the altar together. In other words, this is placing them already at the very beginning of the return, because in Ezra the altar is built very shortly after the return to Zion, the initial return. And then they are ready to build it. And we have in Pasuk Chet, this is Parak Gimel Pasuk Chet, that's chapter 3, verse 8. Uvashana hashenit levo'am el beit Elohim Yerushalayim b'chodesh hasheni hechel Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel v'Yeshua ben Tzadak v'shar chaim hakohanim v'Levim v'chol ba'im me'ashvi Yerushalayim v'yamidu et Levim. So right already in the second year, they are already setting up the worship of the temple. Zerubbabel and Yoshua, it's called here Yeshua, right? Because again, the whole kind of drops, right? So Yeshua, the son of Yotzadak, and Zerubbabel are both involved with setting up the service. And V'yisdu abonim et Echal Hashem, and they laid the foundation. And everyone celebrates, and that's when the people who see it cry. Some of them are shouting with joy, and some of them who remember the first temple are crying. But we're going to come back to that later, because right now we want to talk about Zerubbabel. And what happens is, in Ezra, the way it's described is that other nations, other people want to also participate in building the temple. And who do they come to? Zerubbabel. They approach Zerubbabel, and all the kind of chiefs of the different families. We will build with you. And he says, no, right? Zerubbabel and Yoshua say no. And then we hear that they weaken the hand of the Judeans. Now, again, we're going to talk about this in the next class. It's not so clear that that's why they stopped building, because of fear of the nations. It seems like possibly poverty was a bigger reason. But at any rate, in Parak Hey, chapter 5, we have Haggai and Zechariah who are urging the rebuilding of the temple. It's now the second year of Darius, right? It's been again about 16 years. And they're like, hey, this is ridiculous. This is already Aramaic. That's why it sounds different. So the Haggai and Zechariah prophesied to the Jews of Judea and Jerusalem in the name of God, right? Bedayin kamu Zerubbabel bar Shaltiel v'Yeshua bar Yotzadak v'shariv lemivnei Beit Elah di Yerushalayim v'imhon nevi'aya di Elah misadin lahon. So then Zerubbabel and Yoshua both start building the temple in earnest, and with them are these prophets, kind of urging them on and helping. Okay, and they are in fact able to complete the building in 4 years, in just 4 years. However, when they do that, when they finish it, let's go. I have to skip ahead to where they are finishing. I think it's Parak Zion here. So once they finish it, and I'm opening now, actually it's in the middle of Parak Vav of chapter 6, right? The house was finished. I'm just going to read the English. The house was finished on the 3rd of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. Again, 4 years from the 2nd year to the 6th, right? Everyone is happy. You have the Bnei Israel, the Israelites, Kahanaya v'Levaye, right? The Kohanim and the Leviim, and they are all participate in the dedication of the temple, Chanukat Beit Allah Dana b'chedva, with joy. And so they sacrifice. And who do we not hear about? We don't hear about Zerubbabel. And of course, we don't hear about Yoshua either, right? Zerubbabel and Yoshua are not mentioned in this dedication. No one is mentioned by name, all right? Which is why I would not say that just based on this passage in Ezra, we could say Zerubbabel disappeared. We could say, well, Zerubbabel and Yoshua were there to finish the temple. However, Ezra and Nehemiah, and this is true, Ezra and Nehemiah's approach is that is not to push a king. Ezra and Nehemiah, the book Ezra and Nehemiah, does not push the idea of a king of the Judean province. It pushes the idea of you have really great governors who do what should be done. You have a functioning temple and a wall around Jerusalem. That means you're doing well. You have Nehemiah making sure people are keeping Shabbat. Like, in other words, there are things that need to be done. That is what it means to live in the land, but you don't need a king, right? That's not a problem, and that's not an issue in the book of Ezra. So it's great that you have Zerubbabel and Yoshua working hard to build it. Give them credit, but they're not that important in the framework of the book. So it wouldn't actually be that surprising for the dedication to simply talk about the groups, which is what it does. It talks about Yisrael, it talks about the priests, it talks about the Levites. They're all celebrating, and that's enough. However, we would, after the big lead up that we've seen in the prophetic books, right, in Haggai and in Zechariah, we would expect Zerubbabel to be kind of pumped up a little bit more at the end. And because what we saw in that switch with Zechariah, we saw that switch where all of a sudden he's not named anymore. It's Semach. It sounds like he's gone. What could have happened to Zerubbabel? And again, and this is another reason to not emphasize the need for a king. Because in fact, there's all these hopes placed on Zerubbabel's shoulders and nothing happens. I would also venture to say that I think there wasn't anything really dramatic that happened to him, because it would have said someone would have had to deal with it. Let's say Darius felt that he was getting too big for his britches and had him assassinated. We would see at least a prophecy addressing that. There'd be something, right? I don't think that's what happened. I think either he just got sick and died, or he died of some natural causes, because rough life, maybe something happened and he died, or he was simply recalled to the Persian capital or to the side of the king, as was frequently done with a governor, because you don't want a governor ruling too long because they start being like a king. So it's natural, and especially if you start hearing in the wind that that there are all these hopes of Zerubbabel, the natural thing to do would be to recall him, to switch him out for a different governor. That's the easiest thing to do. That doesn't cause a huge rebellion. It's just like, hey, he served his term. Now it's time to switch him out. So that's very possibly one of those things happened. And that's why Zerubbabel is no longer the one who's going to complete it. And again, I think that this is clearer in the passage that we read in Zechariah rather than the passage in Ezra. I'll take questions and then I'm going to kind of wrap up. So Danny,
if I understand correctly, when in Zechariah, the people burst in tears at the sight of the pathetic temple, what they're reacting to is actually Zerubbabel's failed attempt to build a temple rather than the completed temple, because...
Right. It reads as if, and it's kind of funny, because it reads as if they're actually, that's what's weird, right? Let's go in to the text, because that's where we just were, right? Mm-hmm. So if you actually see in the actual, when the temple's actually finished, then there isn't this kind of mixed feeling, but it also is barely described, which is really weird. You have the sacrifices, but you don't have a lot. Besides Pesach, besides Passover that they celebrate. You don't get a lot of detail. Whereas when they dedicate, you do have this kind of, and everyone's celebrated. They blew the trumpet. So it does seem obvious that well, of course you're disappointed. It's not built yet. Right? And yet it seems to be that there's already an assumption that this is what we're going to have for a while, right? In other words, I think it's interesting because the fact that people are trying to make a big deal out of the foundation of the temple, and then there are people who are crying because they don't think that it should be a big deal because it's such a disappointment. And it seems like perhaps they realize that it's not going to be built for a long time because they just don't have the wherewithal to do it now. And so they're making a fuss of what they can do now. And there are people who are tremendously disappointed. But I think we can all relate to that, right? This idea of this is what we can do now. This is what there is. And other people are saying, well, how can we say this is what there is? This is so not what we should have, right? And that does seem to be connected to kind of essentially the failure to build. But there is this idea that they will eventually come back and build it. So I'm just going to wrap up, and anyone who wants to stay later and ask questions can stay later and ask questions. So what we've seen here, right? If we look at, so we've seen the second Isaiah, right? We've seen really talking about God as the king, and you don't have to worry about people at all. There's no person ruler. And in fact, this is a good thing because all the promises to David are now passed to his people. his people will take that role of kind of ruling, of people, everyone running to listen to the people of Israel. The people themselves, or Zion, are going to take on that role of the ruler, of the promise, rather, not the role, the promise to David, and God himself will rule. And that's the way it should be, right? Then we see in Haggai, especially this promise of Zerubbabel as a ruler, it really is a messianic ruler, and the same way that we see it originally in Zechariah as Zerubbabel as the one who's going to finish the temple, alongside Yoshua, and we start to see why a human ruler is such a problem, because Yoshua has some kind of sinful past we don't know about that must be cleansed, and Zerubbabel disappears. So we see how difficult it is if you're putting your hope in a person to be this messianic ruler or this messianic, and it makes sense, the approach in 2nd Isaiah. At the same time, in Ezra and Nehemiah, it's simply not that important. We have, and we'll look at this more in future classes, in Ezra and Nehemiah, there is a governor or who is appointed, who is a Judean, who is a Judean who's worthy of respect and who does the right thing, and who is appointed by the emperor, by the Persian emperor, and comes, and Ezra gives over the Torah, essentially, right? He teaches people the Torah when they have forgotten a lot of it. Nehemiah builds the walls of Jerusalem and makes sure that people are keeping Shabbat. He makes sure that people are not enslaving people as debt slaves, or rather, he makes sure they free their debt slaves. All sorts of things that you want essentially a ruler to do, but they do it without being a king, and without being set up as some kind of messianic ruler. They are going to be the head for a certain amount of time, and then they are going to move on. They're either going to be recalled by the Persian emperor, or as Nehemiah is once in the middle of his governorship, or they're going to simply pass on the scepter to someone else. Now, we do have Sheshbatzar, who is the first Pekah, he's the first governor with return. He is, in the beginning of Ezra, called a Nasi, like a prince. But that seems to be something that they get away from, right? And there is a kind of, and then there's the question of how much and in fact, what we start to see is this idea, what we have in Zechariah, where you have a king ruling alongside a high priest, right? You have that idea underlying, you could say, the editing of Ezra and Nehemiah, where it kind of wants to set up the idea that Ezra was kind of the priest character and Nehemiah was kind of the king character, the governor character, that they ruled alongside each other. However, that almost certainly was not the case. They almost certainly did not actually overlap the way the book wants you to think they overlapped. And it's possible that Ezra was actually long after Nehemiah in the line of, you could say, succession. But at any rate, so what we see in these works is the difficulty of having these messianic hopes and dealing with people. And we can see the different approaches of, no, it's just going to be God, it has to be purely divine, or these are people with weaknesses that we simply must accept, but they are chosen by God. Or, hey, it doesn't matter. It's these people, as long as they're good, as long as they follow God's law, what God wants, as long as they do good for the people, it's fine. What God promised was returning to the land, rebuilding our temple, rebuilding our city, and having a certain amount of autonomy. So those are all things that are kind of, we can see in these books alongside each other. So thank you for joining me, and I will see you next week.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
See you next week. Take care.